The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 3B in the Cedar County Courthouse hummed with an irritating persistence that seemed to match the tension in the air. It was a Thursday morning in late August, and the Missouri heat had already turned the old building into a sauna, despite the struggling air conditioning unit that rattled in the corner. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of a surprisingly large crowd for what should have been a routine custody hearing. 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez sat perfectly still on her grandmother's lap in the third row of the gallery. Her small hands clutched a worn stuffed rabbit that had once been white, but was now a faded gray from countless nights of desperate hugging. The rabbit's left ear was torn, hastily stitched back together with blue thread that didn't quite match. Emma's dark curls framed a face that was far too serious for a child her age, and her wide brown eyes stared straight ahead, seeing everything and nothing all at once. Maria Rodriguez, Emma's maternal grandmother, held the child with a grip that was both protective and trembling. At 67 years old, Maria had already buried her daughter to cancer and was now fighting to keep her granddaughter from being taken away. The lines on her face had deepened over the past 6 weeks, carved there by sleepless nights and endless worry. She gently stroked Emma's hair, a gesture that had become automatic, almost desperate, a silent prayer that somehow the touch would break through the wall of silence that had imprisoned her granddaughter's voice. 43 days. That's how long it had been since Emma had spoken a single word. At the front of the courtroom, 2 lawyers squared off like prizefighters in expensive suits. On the left stood Margaret Chen, a public defender with 20 years of experience, but a caseload that would break most people. She represented Maria, working pro bono because the state's resources were stretched thin, and Maria's retirement savings had already been depleted by medical bills from her daughter's cancer treatment. Margaret's suit was pressed but dated, her briefcase held together with duct tape on one corner, and the weight of an impossible case showed in the set of her shoulders. On the right stood Robert Harrison III, a lawyer from Kansas City whose retainer fee alone could have paid Maria's rent for a year. His suit was tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his smile was practiced to perfection. He represented Carlos Rodriguez, Miguel's estranged brother, who sat behind him with an expression of manufactured concern that made Maria's stomach turn. Judge Patricia Hallbrook presided over the chaos with the stern efficiency of someone who had seen too many broken families pass through her courtroom. At 59, she was known throughout Cedar County as fair but uncompromising, a woman who followed the letter of the law even when her heart wanted to do otherwise. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the file before her, her face betraying nothing of the internal conflict she felt about this case. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Hallbrook said, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations in the gallery, "you were about to present your argument for why your client should be granted custody of the minor child." Robert Harrison stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. "Your Honor, Carlos Rodriguez is the child's biological uncle, her closest living blood relative on her father's side. While we all sympathize with Mrs. Maria Rodriguez's desire to keep her granddaughter, we must consider what's in the best interest of the child. Mr. Carlos Rodriguez has a stable income, a 3-bedroom home in a good school district, and a man who hasn't seen his niece since she was born," Margaret Chen interrupted, rising to her feet. "Who hasn't spoken to his brother in over 12 years due to a family dispute that resulted in a restraining order, who suddenly appears out of nowhere claiming—" "Counselor," Judge Hallbrook's gavel came down with a sharp crack, "you'll have your turn." Maria felt Emma shift slightly in her lap, the first movement the child had made in over an hour. She looked down and saw that Emma's eyes had moved, no longer staring blankly ahead but focused on something across the courtroom. Maria followed her granddaughter's gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the side door that led to the judge's chambers and the witness waiting area. The arguments continued, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against rocks. Margaret Chen fought valiantly, presenting character witnesses, showing medical records of Maria's good health, demonstrating the bond between grandmother and granddaughter. But the law favored blood relatives, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Carlos Rodriguez sat with his hands folded, occasionally nodding with fake solemnity, playing the part of the concerned uncle perfectly. Emma's breathing had changed. Maria noticed it immediately, the slight quickening, the way the child's small chest rose and fell with increasing rapidity. After weeks of Emma barely responding to anything, this physiological change was striking. The little girl's grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened, her knuckles going white. "Your Honor," Harrison was saying, "we have prepared a comprehensive care plan, including arrangements for therapy to help Emma through this difficult transition." The side door opened. Detective Sarah Chen entered quietly, trying not to disturb the proceedings. She carried a folder of paperwork and was accompanied by a large German shepherd whose brown and black coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The dog moved with the confidence and discipline of a trained police K9, his steps precise, his head held high. Emma's entire body went rigid. Maria felt it instantly, the sudden tension, the sharp intake of breath, the way her granddaughter's small frame seemed to vibrate with an energy that had been absent for 43 days. Emma's eyes locked onto the dog with an intensity that was almost frightening. Judge Holbrook continued reviewing documents, unaware of the small drama unfolding in the gallery. The lawyers argued on, their voices blending into background noise. But Maria's world had narrowed to the child in her arms, the child who was suddenly, impossibly, alive with recognition. Emma began to squirm, trying to slide off her grandmother's lap. And everyone in the courtroom was about to discover that silence, even the most profound silence, could be shattered in an instant. 6 weeks and 2 days before Emma walked toward that police dog in court, Officer Miguel Rodriguez kissed his daughter goodbye for what he believed might be the last time. It was a Tuesday morning, June 17th, and the sun was just beginning to paint the Missouri sky in shades of pink and gold. He knelt down in their small kitchen, eye level with 3-year-old Emma, who was still in her pajamas covered with cartoon butterflies. "Be good for Abuela today, okay, Mija," Miguel said, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. His hand lingered on her cheek perhaps a moment too long, memorizing the feel of her soft skin, the way her nose crinkled when she smiled. "Daddy come home for dinner?" Emma asked, her voice bright with the innocent certainty that of course he would, because he always did. Miguel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll try, baby. I'll try real hard." He didn't tell her that he'd spent the previous 3 nights barely sleeping, reviewing evidence that made his blood run cold. He didn't tell her that the flash drives hidden in his patrol car contained proof that 3 of his fellow officers were dirty. He didn't tell her that he'd already contacted the FBI field office in Kansas City and was scheduled for a meeting the following Monday. He couldn't tell her any of that. She was 3 years old. So instead, he pulled her into a tight hug, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, and whispered, "Daddy loves you more than all the stars in the sky." That was the last time Emma saw her father. At 2:47 p.m. that afternoon, dispatch lost contact with Unit 7, Miguel's patrol car. His last transmission had been routine. 10:08, en route to check reported suspicious activity on Old Timber Road. The logging route was remote, a winding path through dense Ozark forest that locals rarely used anymore since the mill had closed 5 years prior. When Miguel didn't respond to 3 consecutive radio checks, Sergeant Morrison's gut told him something was very wrong. Deputy Jake Chen found the patrol car at 4:23 p.m. The scene was wrong in ways that made experienced officers' skin crawl. The vehicle sat at an odd angle on the shoulder of the dirt road, driver's door hanging open, engine still running. The computer terminal glowed with Miguel's last query, a license plate search that had been interrupted mid-entry. His coffee sat in the cup holder, still warm enough to steam faintly in the afternoon heat. His service weapon was missing from its holster, which was still properly secured to his duty belt lying on the driver's seat. But it was the radio that disturbed Jake the most. It was turned to an open channel, volume up, as if Miguel had wanted to broadcast something but never got the chance, or as if someone wanted anyone who approached to be heard coming. "We've got a situation," Jake radioed back to dispatch, his voice tight with controlled alarm. "Officer may be down, needs search and rescue now." Within an hour, Cedar County Sheriff's Department had mobilized every available unit. By nightfall, the Missouri State Highway Patrol had joined the search. K-9 units from 3 counties arrived, their dogs straining at their leads, confused by the scent trails that seemed to lead in multiple directions before vanishing entirely. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the dense canopy overhead, their searchlights cutting through the gathering darkness like desperate fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. They found nothing. No blood, no shell casings, no signs of struggle, no footprints beyond those that Miguel's boots should have made approaching the vehicle. It was as if Officer Miguel Rodriguez had simply evaporated into the humid Missouri air, leaving behind only the ghost of his presence, a running engine, cooling coffee, and a radio broadcasting silence. The search continued for 5 days. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement, forming lines that swept through miles of forest. Miguel's face appeared on every news channel in the state. The FBI confirmed they'd been scheduled to meet with him but wouldn't comment on why. His fellow officers, at least the ones who weren't involved in what he'd discovered, worked double shifts, refusing to give up. Duke, a German Shepherd K-9 who'd worked search and rescue operations with Miguel on 3 previous cases, was brought in on day 2. The dog had always been steady, reliable, one of the best in the state. But on the logging road, Duke behaved strangely. He would sit at certain spots and whine, a low keening sound that his handler had never heard him make. At one location about 50 yards into the tree line, Duke lay down and refused to move, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that humans couldn't decipher. The handlers noted it in their reports but couldn't make sense of it. Back home, Maria tried to explain to Emma that Daddy was missing, that people were looking for him, that they needed to be brave and pray. But how do you explain such an adult concept to a 3-year-old who still believed that daddies were invincible, that police officers were heroes who always came home? Emma stopped eating. She stopped playing. She would sit by the front window for hours, waiting, watching, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Maria would find her there at dawn, having never gone to bed, still waiting for headlights to pull into the driveway. On day 7, when the official search was scaled back to a recovery operation, Emma spoke her last words for what would be 43 days. She looked at her grandmother with eyes too old for her young face and whispered, "Daddy's lost." Then she stopped talking altogether, retreating into a silence as deep and mysterious as the forest that had swallowed her father whole. The investigation remained open but went cold. Miguel Rodriguez was gone, and nobody knew if he was alive, dead, or somewhere in between. All they had were questions without answers, and a little girl whose voice had been stolen by grief and trauma, a voice that wouldn't return until the day she saw a German Shepherd in a courtroom and remembered something everyone else had forgotten. Carlos Rodriguez walked into the Cedar County Courthouse like a man who owned the place. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd never worried about money, never struggled to make rent, never chosen between groceries and medication. At 42, he was 3 years older than his missing brother Miguel, but you wouldn't know they were related by looking at them. Where Miguel had chosen service and sacrifice, Carlos had chosen profit and self-interest. The expensive charcoal suit he wore probably cost more than Maria's car. His silver watch caught the light as he adjusted his cufflinks, a Rolex that whispered wealth without shouting it. His hair was professionally styled, his nails manicured, and his smile was the kind that had been perfected in boardrooms and country clubs. Everything about Carlos Rodriguez screamed success, which made his sudden interest in a traumatized 3-year-old girl all the more suspicious. "Mr. Rodriguez," his lawyer Robert Harrison greeted him in the hallway outside the courtroom. "Remember, we present you as the concerned uncle, family-oriented, stable, capable. Let me do the talking." Carlos nodded, but his eyes were cold, calculating. He'd played many roles in his 42 years: dutiful son, ambitious businessman, respectable citizen. Adding loving uncle to the list was just another performance, and Carlos had always been an excellent actor. The truth was, Carlos hadn't seen his brother Miguel since their parents' funeral 12 years ago. That day had ended with shouting, with accusations, with Miguel physically throwing Carlos out of the family home and threatening to file a restraining order if he ever came back. Their parents had left everything to Miguel: the house, the land, a modest savings account, because they'd known Carlos would burn through it in months. Carlos had never forgiven that betrayal, never forgiven being labeled as the irresponsible one, the disappointment. For 12 years he'd built his life far from Cedar County, far from memories of the brother who'd been everything he wasn't. Carlos had found success in Kansas City, though the nature of that success wasn't something he discussed in polite company. He drove a Mercedes, lived in a penthouse, and cultivated relationships with people who could be useful. When Miguel disappeared, Carlos's first thought wasn't concern, it was opportunity. Because Carlos knew something that the police didn't, something that the search teams hadn't discovered. He knew exactly why Miguel had vanished, and he knew that his brother had hidden something that could destroy everything Carlos had built. Maria Rodriguez watched her former brother-in-law enter the courtroom and felt her blood turn to ice. She'd only met Carlos a handful of times over the years, always at family gatherings where he'd shown up late, left early, and treated everyone like they were beneath him. At her daughter Rosa's funeral, Miguel's wife, Carlos hadn't even bothered to attend. Now he wanted to raise Rosa's daughter. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. "He's not here for Emma," Maria whispered to her lawyer Margaret Chen. "He's here for something else." Margaret squeezed her client's hand sympathetically, but the truth in her eyes was hard to miss. "Unfortunately, what he's here for doesn't matter. What matters is what we can prove, and right now, the law favors blood relatives with financial stability." The hearing began with Harrison painting a picture of Carlos as a reformed family man who'd made mistakes in his youth, but had grown into a responsible, successful businessman. He presented financial records showing an annual income that made Maria's modest pension look like pocket change. He showed photographs of a spacious 3-bedroom home in an upscale Kansas City suburb, complete with a backyard and a room already prepared for Emma, painted pink, filled with toys that still had price tags attached. "Mr. Rodriguez has taken a leave of absence from his work to focus entirely on providing a stable home for his niece during this difficult transition," Harrison explained smoothly. "He's enrolled in parenting classes, consulted with child psychologists, and has a comprehensive care plan ready to address Emma's trauma and selective mutism." It all sounded perfect, too perfect. Maria knew that everything Carlos touched turned to fool's gold, shiny on the surface, worthless underneath. When it was Margaret's turn, she fought hard. She presented witnesses who testified to Maria's dedication, her love for Emma, the bond between grandmother and granddaughter. Mrs. Peterson from next door described how Maria would sit up all night with Emma during the child's nightmares, singing lullabies in Spanish until the little girl finally slept. Dr. Sarah Winters, Emma's pediatrician, testified that the child showed signs of attachment to Maria that were crucial for her psychological recovery. "Your Honor," Margaret argued passionately, "Emma has already lost her mother to cancer and her father to whatever tragedy befell him. Taking her from the one stable presence in her life, the grandmother who's raised her since birth, would be psychological devastation on top of existing trauma." But Harrison was ready. "Mrs. Rodriguez is 67 years old, Your Honor. While we don't question her love, We must question her ability to provide long-term care. What happens when Emma is 10, 15? Will Mrs. Rodriguez be able to keep up with a teenager's needs? Mr. Carlos Rodriguez is 42, healthy, and financially equipped to provide for Emma through her entire childhood and beyond. Judge Holbrook listened to both sides, her face an unreadable mask. She looked at the file before her, then at Emma sitting silently in Maria's lap, then at Carlos with his expensive suit and practiced expressions of concern. "This is not a decision to be made lightly," the judge finally said. "I need to consider." That's when the side door opened. Detective Sarah Chen entered with Duke, the German Shepherd, and everything was about to change. Because while Carlos sat in that courtroom playing the role of concerned uncle, he was actually there for one reason only: to find out if his 3-year-old niece knew where her father had hidden the evidence that could send Carlos to prison for the rest of his life. The evidence that proved Carlos wasn't a legitimate businessman, but a facilitator in a drug trafficking operation that used the Cedar County Sheriff's evidence room as a distribution hub. Miguel had discovered it all, and Miguel had to disappear. Now Carlos just needed to make sure that whatever Miguel had told his daughter died with the investigation. Gaining custody of Emma wasn't about family. It was about tying up loose ends. And Carlos Rodriguez had always been very good at making problems disappear. Detective Sarah Chen hadn't planned to be in courtroom 3B that Thursday morning. She'd taken a personal day to handle Duke's retirement paperwork, 8 years of service, countless successful operations, and now it was time for the German Shepherd to live out his remaining years in peace. But the courthouse administrative office had been backed up, forms had been misplaced, and she'd been told to wait. So she'd grabbed Duke's lead and decided to sit in her car until her number was called. Then she'd received the text from the clerk: "Bring the retirement forms to Judge Holbrook's chambers directly. She'll sign them between hearings." Sarah was 36 years old and had spent 14 years in law enforcement. She'd seen things that haunted her dreams and worked cases that restored her faith in humanity. But nothing in her career had affected her quite like the disappearance of Officer Miguel Rodriguez. They hadn't been close friends, but they'd worked together on several search and rescue operations where Duke's nose had been essential. Miguel had been good people, the kind of cop who actually gave a damn, who treated everyone with respect, who believed the badge meant something. Duke padded beside her as they entered the courthouse through the side entrance, his nails clicking softly on the tile. At 7 years old, the German Shepherd was in his prime, muscular and alert, his brown and black coat glossy with health. His ears swiveled constantly, taking in every sound, his dark eyes missing nothing. Duke had been Sarah's partner for 6 years, and in that time, they'd found 12 missing persons, tracked countless suspects, and built a reputation as one of the best K-9 teams in Missouri. But Miguel's case had broken something in Duke. Sarah remembered it clearly, day 2 of the search, when Duke had been brought to the logging road where Miguel's patrol car had been found. The German Shepherd had been eager at first, pulling at his lead, nose to the ground. But then his behavior had shifted into something Sarah had never seen before. Duke had tracked a scent about 50 yards into the forest, then stopped at a small clearing. He'd sat down, tilted his head back, and released a sound that still gave Sarah chills when she thought about it. A mournful howl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, echoing through the trees like a song of grief. "What's he doing?" Sergeant Morrison had asked, confusion written across his face. "I don't know," Sarah had admitted. "I've never seen him do this." Duke had refused to move from that spot for 20 minutes. When they'd finally coaxed him forward, he tracked another scent to a ravine about 2 miles away. There, he'd lain down at the edge and whined, a high-pitched sound of distress. The search teams had rappelled into the ravine, finding nothing but dense vegetation and rocks. They'd chalked Duke's behavior up to the stress of the search, the confusion of multiple overlapping scent trails, maybe even the unseasonable heat. But Sarah had known Duke too well to accept that explanation. The dog was telling them something. They just didn't understand the language. Now, as Sarah approached the side door of courtroom 3B, Duke suddenly stopped. His entire body went rigid, his ears perking forward with laser focus. Sarah felt the change in tension through the lead. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Duke's nose twitched rapidly, processing scents that humans couldn't begin to perceive. His tail, usually held in a neutral position while working, began to wag slowly, not with excitement but with recognition. Something in that courtroom had triggered a response in the dog, something significant. Sarah hesitated, her hand on the door handle. Judge Holbrook's chambers were on the other side of this courtroom, and she was already running late for the appointment. But Duke's behavior concerned her. The German Shepherd had started to vibrate slightly, a tremor running through his muscular frame that Sarah recognized as intense focus mixed with emotional response. "Easy, Duke. Easy," she murmured, using the calming voice she'd developed over years of partnership. She opened the door quietly, trying not to disturb the proceedings. The courtroom was in session, lawyers arguing back and forth about custody arrangements. Sarah's eyes immediately scanned for threats, old habits from her training, but all she saw was a typical family court hearing: an older woman holding a small child, a man in an expensive suit, lawyers, a judge, the usual courthouse crowd. Duke stepped through the doorway and immediately turned his head toward the gallery, toward the third row where Maria sat with Emma. The dog's breathing changed, becoming faster, more intense. His dark eyes locked onto something with an unwavering stare that Sarah had only seen a handful of times in their partnership, the look Duke got when he'd found what he was searching for. Sarah followed his gaze and saw the little girl. She recognized her immediately from the news coverage: Emma Rodriguez, Miguel's daughter, the child who'd stopped speaking after her father vanished, the center of this custody battle. Emma was staring back at Duke with an intensity that matched the dog's own focused attention. Sarah watched, fascinated, as the little girl's body language completely transformed. The child had been limp and listless in her grandmother's lap, but now she was rigid with attention, her eyes wide, her small hands gripping her stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Duke took a step forward, pulling gently at the lead, not with the aggressive focus he used when tracking a suspect, but with something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, concern. Sarah had worked with this dog for 6 years and prided herself on reading his body language, but this was different. This was personal. The lawyers continued their arguments, oblivious to the silent communication happening between a traumatized child and a police dog. But Sarah noticed. And more importantly, she noticed the way Duke's tail had started wagging with more conviction, the way his ears stayed forward, the way every fiber of his being was focused on that little girl. It was the same intense focus he'd shown during Miguel's search, the same distress, the same sense that Duke knew something humans didn't, something important that he couldn't communicate with words. Emma began to squirm in her grandmother's lap, trying to get down. Her eyes never left Duke's face. And Duke, despite all his training to remain calm and controlled in public spaces, began to whine softly, that same high-pitched sound of distress he'd made at the ravine 6 weeks ago. Sarah's instincts, honed by 14 years of law enforcement, suddenly screamed that something significant was about to happen. She just didn't know what. She was about to find out. Maria felt Emma's small body shift in her lap, and for a moment she thought the child was just repositioning herself for comfort. But then Emma's hands pressed against Maria's arms, not gently, but with insistence, with purpose. The little girl was pushing herself up, trying to stand, her eyes locked on the German Shepherd across the courtroom with an intensity that made Maria's breath catch. "Emma," Maria whispered, her arms instinctively tightening around her granddaughter. "Mija, what?" But Emma was already sliding down, her small feet touching the floor. The stuffed rabbit fell from her grip, landing with a soft thud on the wooden floor. For 43 days, that rabbit had been Emma's constant companion, her security blanket, the one thing she wouldn't let go of even in sleep. Now it lay abandoned as the 3-year-old took her first unsteady step toward the police dog. Robert Harrison was mid-sentence, explaining Carlos's proposed visitation schedule with maternal relatives, when he noticed Judge Holbrook's attention had shifted. The judge's eyes had moved from the documents before her to something in the gallery, her expression changing from judicial neutrality to something like wonder. "Your Honor," Harrison said, confused by the interruption to his rhythm. Judge Holbrook raised one hand, silencing him without looking away from the small child now walking across her courtroom. "Wait," she said quietly. The word rippled through the space like a stone dropped in still water. Conversation stopped mid-whisper. Heads turned. The court reporter's fingers paused above the keys. Even Carlos, who'd been checking his phone under the table, looked up to see what had captured everyone's attention. Emma Rodriguez, the silent child who hadn't spoken in 6 weeks, was walking toward a police dog with the determined gait of someone on a mission. Her small legs moved unsteadily, her arms held slightly out for balance, her face set with a concentration that seemed far too serious for someone so young. She was wearing a yellow dress with white flowers that her grandmother had carefully ironed that morning, and her dark curls bounced with each step. Detective Sarah Chen felt Duke pull against the lead, not hard but with clear intention. "Duke, stay," she commanded softly, but the dog's training was warring with something deeper, something instinctual. His tail wagged faster now, and he whined again, that same sound he'd made at the ravine during Miguel's search. Margaret Chen rose slowly from her chair, her legal instincts screaming that something important was happening, even if she didn't understand what. She glanced at Maria, who had tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her mouth. Emma was halfway across the courtroom now, 10 feet, 8 feet, 6 feet. Carlos Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. Something was wrong. The child wasn't supposed to react, wasn't supposed to do anything. She'd been catatonic for weeks, a perfect little victim too traumatized to be a threat. But now she was moving, focused, purposeful, and Carlos felt the first cold finger of fear trace down his spine. Duke's whole body was trembling now, every muscle taut. Sarah had seen the dog track criminals through swamps, remain calm during gunfire, work tirelessly through natural disasters. But she'd never seen him like this, torn between training and emotion, between discipline and something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. "Everyone stay calm," Judge Holbrook said, her voice quiet but authoritative. She'd seen many strange things in her courtroom over the years, but a mute child suddenly animated by the presence of a police dog was a first. Her hand hovered near her gavel, ready but not striking, letting the moment unfold. 4 feet, 3 feet. Emma stopped directly in front of Duke. The German Shepherd towered over her tiny frame, 75 pounds of muscle, and training to her 30 pounds of little girl fragility. But there was no fear in Emma's eyes. Instead, there was recognition, certainty, and something that looked almost like relief. Sarah relaxed her grip on the lead slightly, trusting Duke's training, trusting the moment. The dog lowered his head to the child's level, his dark eyes meeting hers. His tail wagged slowly, carefully, as if he understood that this moment was delicate, important, sacred. Emma reached out her small hand, the same hand that had gripped her grandmother's fingers in silence for 6 weeks, the same hand that had refused to hold crayons when therapists tried art therapy, the same hand that had pushed away food and comfort. Now it moved with confidence, with purpose, trembling slightly as it touched the top of Duke's head. The courtroom held its collective breath. Emma's fingers sank into Duke's fur, feeling the warmth of the living animal beneath. The dog remained perfectly still, though his entire body quivered with restrained emotion. Emma's other hand came up, both small palms now resting on Duke's head, and she leaned forward slightly, bringing her face close to his. And then she spoke. Her voice was small and cracked from disuse, barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the courtroom it rang out like a bell. 2 words, just 2 simple words that changed everything. Daddy's friend. Time stopped. Maria's sob broke the silence first, a sound of joy and pain and hope all mixed together. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Margaret Chen grabbed the table for support, her mind racing through the implications. Judge Holbrook's eyes went wide, her professional mask slipping to reveal naked shock. Duke's reaction was immediate and visceral. The German shepherd's tail began wagging furiously, and he pressed his head into Emma's small hands, whining softly. It was the same sound he'd made 6 weeks ago, the sound that no one had understood. But now, in this moment, it was clear. Duke had been grieving. Duke had known. Duke had been trying to tell them all along. Detective Sarah Chen felt goosebumps rise on her arms. Her 14 years of law enforcement experience suddenly crystallized into a single, stunning realization. This dog had worked with Miguel Rodriguez. This dog had searched for Miguel Rodriguez. This dog had tried to show them something during that search, something they'd missed. And this child, this silent, traumatized child, recognized Duke, called him her daddy's friend. Carlos Rodriguez went pale, his expensive suit suddenly feeling too tight. His carefully constructed performance crumbled as panic bloomed in his chest. The child remembered. After 6 weeks of silence, of trauma, of appearing completely shut down, she remembered. And if she remembered the dog, what else might she remember? Emma pressed her face against Duke's fur and her small voice spoke again, stronger this time, more words tumbling out after weeks of silence. Daddy's friend. Where's Daddy? Where'd Daddy go? The courtroom erupted. Maria was standing now, moving toward her granddaughter. Margaret Chen was frantically taking notes. Harrison was on his feet, objecting to something he couldn't quite articulate. Judge Holbrook's gavel came down, calling for order, but her hands were shaking. And Detective Sarah Chen, her mind already racing through the implications, caught Judge Holbrook's eye and mouthed 2 words that would restart an investigation everyone had thought was dead. Emergency recess. Judge Holbrook's gavel cracked against the sound block 3 times before the courtroom finally quieted. Her hands trembled slightly. A tell she would have been mortified to know was visible, as she looked from the small child clinging to the police dog, to Detective Chen standing rigid with sudden understanding, to Carlos Rodriguez, whose face had gone from tanned confidence to ashen panic in the span of 30 seconds. This court is in recess, Judge Holbrook announced, her voice carrying the weight of 23 years on the bench. Bailiff, clear the courtroom. Detective Chen, my chambers. Now, Mrs. Rodriguez, please bring Emma. Mr. Harrison, Mr. Chen. She gestured to Margaret's co-counsel who'd been sitting quietly. You'll join us. Carlos stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Your Honor, I don't see how this disruption. Sit down. Judge Holbrook's words were ice. You'll wait here until you're called. Sarah Chen was already moving, her training kicking in as her mind raced through connections she should have made 6 weeks ago. Duke's behavior during the search. The way he'd howled in that clearing. The way he'd refused to leave the ravine. The German shepherd hadn't been confused or stressed. He'd been tracking Miguel's scent and trying to communicate what he'd found. Come on, Duke, Sarah murmured, leading the dog who was now pressing against Emma's legs, whining softly as Maria scooped her granddaughter into her arms. The little girl reached back toward the dog, her small voice, unused for so long, calling out, Daddy's friend, don't go. He's coming with us, Mija, Maria whispered, her tears falling into Emma's dark curls. He's coming. Judge Holbrook's chambers, the formal atmosphere dissolved into urgent action. Sarah immediately pulled out her phone, dialing Sergeant Morrison. Sir, we need to reopen the Rodriguez case. Now, something just happened in court. Miguel's daughter just spoke for the first time in 6 weeks and she recognized my K9. Duke worked with Miguel on 3 operations. I think, she paused, the realization hitting her fully. I think Duke tried to tell us something during the search that we didn't understand. Judge Holbrook gestured for everyone to sit, but Sarah remained standing, packing as she talked. Emma sat in Maria's lap, her small hands still reaching toward Duke, who sat at attention beside Sarah but kept his eyes locked on the child. "Tell me exactly what happened during the original search," Judge Holbrook said, her judicial mind already cataloging evidence, weighing implications. Sarah pulled up her notes on her phone, scrolling through reports she'd filed 6 weeks ago. Day 2, we brought Duke to the logging road where Miguel's patrol car was found. Duke tracked a scent about 50 yards into the forest to a clearing. He sat down and howled, not a normal bark or alert, but a sustained howl. It went on for almost 3 minutes. Then he tracked another scent 2 miles east to a ravine. Same behavior there. Lay down, wouldn't move, kept whining and staring into the ravine. "What did the search teams find?" Margaret asked, taking notes frantically. "Nothing. We rappelled into the ravine, searched the entire area. Dense vegetation, some rocks, a small stream at the bottom. No evidence of Miguel or any struggle. We thought Duke was overwhelmed by multiple scent trails or reacting to the stress of the search." Sarah's voice was tight with frustration. "We should have listened to him." Emma had been quiet, watching Duke intently, but now she spoke again, her voice still small but growing stronger. "Big Dog cried. In the woods. Big Dog looked for Daddy." Everyone in the room froze. Maria's grip on Emma tightened. "Mija, when did you see the big dog in the woods?" But Emma had retreated slightly, her face buried in her grandmother's shoulder. Judge Holbrook made a quick decision. "We need a child psychologist here immediately. Someone trained in trauma-informed interviewing. We can't push her, but if she knows something about her father's disappearance." "I'll call Dr. Lisa Martinez," Margaret interjected. "She works with the county on abuse cases, specializes in interviewing young children." The door burst open without warning. Sergeant Morrison stood there, breathing hard from running through the courthouse. Behind him was Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI field office in Kansas City, the same agent Miguel had been scheduled to meet with the Monday after he disappeared. "Someone want to tell me why I just got a call about Miguel Rodriguez's daughter breaking her silence?" Morrison demanded. Sarah quickly explained what had happened in the courtroom. Agent Torres listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. "We need to talk about why Officer Rodriguez was scheduled to meet with us," she said carefully. "And we need to talk about who might have known about that meeting." "Miguel was investigating something," Morrison said heavily, the weight of guilt evident in his voice. "He'd been acting strange for weeks before he disappeared. Paranoid. Said he couldn't trust certain people in the department. I thought he was stressed, working too hard. I should have pushed harder, asked more questions." "Who knew about his FBI meeting?" Judge Holbrook asked. "Only me and his direct partner, Officer Jason Webb," Morrison said. "Miguel was careful. He said he had evidence of something big, but he wouldn't tell me what until he'd verified everything. Said it was safer that way." Agent Torres' phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her jaw tightened. "I just requested Miguel Rodriguez's phone records from the week before he disappeared. We're also pulling records for everyone in this custody hearing." Her eyes moved to the door, where Carlos Rodriguez waited in the courtroom, including his brother. "There's something else," Sarah said slowly, pieces clicking together in her mind. "During the custody arguments, Harrison mentioned Carlos moved back to Kansas City and started a business about 6 months ago. That's the same time Miguel started acting paranoid." Maria had been quiet, but now she spoke up, her voice shaking with anger and realization. "Carlos called me 2 days after Miguel disappeared, before the news even went public. He asked if Miguel had left any papers at my house, any files or documents. I thought it was strange, but I was so worried about Miguel I didn't think much of it." "What did you tell him?" Agent Torres asked sharply. "That I hadn't seen Miguel in a week, which was true. He hung up without even asking about Emma." Dr. Martinez arrived within 20 minutes, a kind-faced woman in her 50s with warm eyes and a gentle demeanor. She spent a few moments just sitting with Emma, not asking questions, just playing with some toys she'd brought. Duke lay beside them, and Emma kept one small hand resting on his fur, as if the contact gave her courage. Finally, Dr. Martinez pulled out some paper and crayons. "Emma, honey, can you draw me a picture of the big dog, the one you saw in the woods?" Emma took a purple crayon and began to draw. Not just Duke, but trees, lots of trees, and in the corner a small building with a triangular roof, and stick figures, one tall, one small. "Can you tell me about this picture?" Dr. Martinez asked gently. Emma pointed to the tall stick figure. "Daddy," then to the small one, "Me," then to the building, "Secret place. Daddy said don't tell, but Daddy's gone so long." The room went absolutely still. "Emma," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "did you go to this secret place with your daddy?" The little girl nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Day before Daddy got lost, we went to woods. Daddy said hide the papers where bad people can't find, said it our special secret." Agent Torres was already on her phone. "I need search teams mobilized immediately. K-9 units, aerial support, everything. Rodriguez took his daughter somewhere before he disappeared, somewhere he hid evidence." Sarah looked at Duke, who had his head resting on Emma's lap. "And this dog knows where," she said quietly. "He's been trying to show us for 6 weeks." Outside in the courtroom, Carlos Rodriguez sat alone, his expensive suit feeling like a noose tightening around his neck. Through the closed door, he could hear muffled, urgent voices, phones ringing, people moving with purpose. He pulled out his own phone with shaking hands and typed a quick message. "The kid is talking. Compromised. Initiate contingency." The response came back in seconds. "Understood, cleaning up now." But Carlos didn't know that Agent Torres had already flagged his phone for monitoring. Didn't know that his message had just been intercepted by federal authorities. Didn't know that his attempt to cover his tracks had just become evidence in a case that was about to blow wide open. In the judge's chambers, Emma drew another picture, this time of her daddy's face, and in his hands, a folder with papers. "Important papers," she said softly. "Daddy said they keep us safe, keep everybody safe." And somewhere in the Ozark wilderness, in a ravine that had already been searched once, Miguel Rodriguez lay in the darkness, barely clinging to life, waiting for rescue that was finally on its way. Within 90 minutes, the woods off Old Timber Road swarmed with activity that rivaled the original search operation 6 weeks earlier. But this time, they had something they didn't have before: a 3-year-old girl's drawings and a German shepherd who'd been trying to tell them the truth all along. Duke strained at his lead, pulling Sarah Chen toward the same clearing where he'd howled during the original search. Emma's drawing had shown trees with distinctive markings, 3 birch trees in a triangle formation with a small structure nearby. Sarah's heart hammered as they pushed through the underbrush and found exactly that: 3 white birch trees, their bark peeling in characteristic strips, forming a natural triangle. "This is it," Sarah called out to Agent Torres and the team behind her. "This is where Duke stopped before." Duke circled the clearing, nose to the ground, then sat beside a small hunting cabin that was barely visible through the overgrown vegetation. The structure was old, maybe abandoned for 20 years, its roof sagging and walls weathered to gray. But the door, when Agent Torres pulled it open, showed fresh scrape marks on the frame. "Someone's been here recently," she said, drawing her weapon. "Clear the structure." Federal agents swept through the tiny cabin, just one room with a rusted wood stove and a collapsed cot. But Sarah noticed Duke's attention wasn't on the main room. The dog kept returning to the stone fireplace, scratching at the base, whining with frustration. "Here," Sarah said, kneeling beside the fireplace. "He's alerting to something." Agent Torres joined her, running her hands along the stones. One moved slightly under her touch. She pulled, and an entire section of the fireplace base swung outward, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a waterproof military-grade bag, the kind designed to survive harsh conditions. Torres pulled it out with gloved hands and carefully unzipped it. Inside were 3 flash drives, a digital camera, a stack of photographs, and a notebook filled with Miguel's precise handwriting. She whistled low. "This is it. This is what Rodriguez died to protect." "He's not dead," Sarah said fiercely, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Back at the command center hastily established in the courthouse parking lot, a team of FBI analysts began combing through the evidence Miguel had hidden. What they found made seasoned federal agents shake their heads in disbelief. Miguel Rodriguez had documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who knew his life depended on the evidence holding up in court. Photographs showed Cedar County Sheriff's evidence room at night, with clear images of Officer Jason Webb and 2 other deputies, Marcus Freeman and David Chen, removing sealed drug packages from the evidence locker. Time-stamped video files showed the same officers meeting with a man in expensive suits at various locations around Kansas City. That man was Carlos Rodriguez. "Look at this," one analyst said, pulling up financial records Miguel had somehow obtained. "Carlos Rodriguez's consulting business is a shell company. Money flows in from multiple LLCs, all tied to known drug distribution networks. Then it flows out to these 3 officers in the form of security consulting fees." Agent Torres flipped through Miguel's notebook, reading entries that painted a damning picture. Miguel had started noticing discrepancies in evidence 3 months ago, drugs logged into evidence that disappeared before trial, quantities that didn't match arrest reports, cases that fell apart due to mishandled evidence. He'd begun his own investigation, working alone, trusting no one. "Listen to this entry from June 10th, Torres read aloud. "Confirmed Carlos is the middleman. He receives product from evidence room, redistributes through his KC network, pays off Webb, Freeman, and Chen. Conservative estimate, $2 million in cocaine moved in last 6 months alone. Meeting with FBI scheduled for June 23rd. Need to get Emma somewhere safe first. If anything happens to me, the evidence is hidden where only she would know to look." "He never made it to that June 23rd meeting," Sergeant Morrison said, his face ashen. "Jason Webb was his partner. Webb knew everything about Miguel's schedule, his routes, his patterns." "And Carlos knew about the FBI meeting," Torres added. "Look at this phone record. Webb called Carlos the day before Miguel disappeared. 37-minute conversation." At that moment, forensic accountants made another discovery. "We've got Carlos Rodriguez's financial records from this morning. Huge cash withdrawal, $50,000 made at 7:00 a.m. today before the custody hearing. And there's a text message we intercepted sent from the courthouse." She pulled it up on screen. "The kid is talking, compromised, initiate contingency." "He was planning to run," Morrison breathed. "The custody hearing wasn't about Emma at all." "It was about finding out what she knew," Torres confirmed, "and eliminating the threat if necessary. We need to pick up Carlos Rodriguez immediately, along with Webb, Freeman, and Chen." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Duke had left the clearing and was pulling her deeper into the woods, following the same path he tried to show them 6 weeks ago. The path that led to the ravine. "Duke, wait," Sarah called, but the German shepherd was insistent, almost frantic. His training had broken down completely, replaced by desperate urgency. He pulled so hard Sarah had to let go of the lead, watching as the dog crashed through underbrush toward the ravine's edge. Sarah and a team of officers followed, equipment rattling as they ran. They reached the ravine's edge, the same spot where Duke had lain down and refused to move during the original search. The drop was steep, maybe 40 feet, covered in thick vegetation and jutting rocks. Duke barked, a sharp sound of alert that Sarah had heard 100 times before. But this bark was different, higher pitched, more urgent. The dog paced at the ravine's edge, then did something Sarah had never seen him do on duty. He started to climb down on his own, scrambling over rocks with complete disregard for his safety. "Duke, no," Sarah shouted, but the dog was already 10 feet down, disappearing into the vegetation. Agent Torres grabbed climbing gear from one of her team. "Get me down there, now." 3 agents rappelled into the ravine while others set up spotlights from above, illuminating the dense growth below. Sarah watched, her heart in her throat, as the lights swept across the ravine floor. Then she heard it, a shout from below. "We've got him. We've got Miguel Rodriguez. He's alive. We need medical evac immediately." The words electrified the search team. Medics rushed forward with equipment. A helicopter was already being diverted from the nearest hospital. And Sarah, standing at the ravine's edge with tears streaming down her face, heard Duke barking, not with distress this time, but with joy. At the courthouse, Emma sat in her grandmother's lap, drawing another picture with Dr. Martinez's crayons. This one showed stick figures, 2 tall ones standing together, 1 small one between them, and a brown dog with a happy face. "Who are these people, Emma?" Dr. Martinez asked gently. Emma pointed to each figure. "Daddy, Abuela, me." Then she pointed to the dog, Daddy's friend. "He found Daddy, he's a good dog." Maria pulled Emma close, sobbing with relief and hope. In the hallway outside, federal agents were taking Carlos Rodriguez into custody, reading him rights he barely heard over the roaring in his ears. His expensive suit was rumpled now, his carefully constructed life demolished by a 3-year-old's memory and a dog's loyalty. Jason Webb was arrested at his home, along with Freeman and Chen. The evidence Miguel had died to protect, except he hadn't died, he'd survived. He'd held on for 44 days in that ravine, would put all of them away for decades. And somewhere in the Ozark wilderness, paramedics were stabilizing a severely dehydrated, injured, but living Miguel Rodriguez, while a German shepherd named Duke lay beside him, refusing to leave his friend's side. Emma's 2 words in that courtroom, "Daddy's friend," had started a cascade that exposed corruption, solved a mystery, and brought a hero home. Now all that remained was the reunion that a little girl had been waiting 44 days to have. Miguel Rodriguez regained consciousness in the medical helicopter, his first coherent thought being a single word, "Emma." The paramedic leaning over him had tears in her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "She's safe. Your daughter is safe. She's the one who saved you." He'd survived 44 days in that ravine on rainwater collected in his cupped hands, wild berries he could reach from his position, and the kind of stubborn will that comes from being a father with a daughter who needs him. The corrupt officers had thrown him into the ravine after he'd refused to reveal where he'd hidden the evidence, assuming the fall and the elements would finish what their beating had started. They'd been wrong. Miguel had landed on a narrow ledge 15 feet down, obscured by vegetation, his legs shattered and ribs broken. Every time he tried to call out during the initial search, his damaged ribs sent white-hot pain through his chest, reducing his shouts to barely audible gasps. But he'd heard the search teams. He'd heard Duke's howl, so close, so heartbreakingly close, and he'd tried to respond. The dog had known. Duke had known exactly where he was. At St. Mary's Medical Center in Kansas City, doctors worked for 7 hours to repair Miguel's shattered femur, set his ribs, treat the severe infection that had nearly killed him in the final week, and address the dehydration and malnutrition that had wasted his body to almost nothing. But Miguel Rodriguez was a fighter. Within 3 days, he was conscious and demanding to see his daughter. Maria brought Emma to the hospital on a sunny afternoon in late September. The little girl held her grandmother's hand tightly as they walked down the corridor, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She'd been told Daddy was found, that Daddy was alive, but after 44 days of absence, the concept of his return felt almost mythical. The hospital room door opened. Miguel sat propped up in bed, his leg in a cast elevated by pulleys, his face gaunt and bruised but wearing a smile that broke through the damage like sunrise through storm clouds. "Mija," he whispered. Emma froze for just a moment. This daddy looked different, thinner, hurt. But then recognition flooded through her and she ran, Maria barely catching her before she could crash into the hospital bed. Maria lifted Emma gently onto the bed, and Miguel wrapped his daughter in his arms, both of them crying, both of them holding on like they'd never let go. "Daddy came home," Emma sobbed into his chest. "Daddy's friend found you. The big dog found you." "I know, baby, I know. You were so brave. You were so smart." Miguel looked up at Maria over Emma's head, his eyes saying everything words couldn't. "Thank you for protecting her. Thank you for fighting for her. Thank you for never giving up." Duke visited the next day, a special exception arranged by hospital administration after Agent Torres made a few calls. The German Shepherd walked into Miguel's room with Detective Sarah Chen, and the reunion between man and dog was almost as emotional as the one with Emma. Duke placed his head on Miguel's bed, tail wagging, and Miguel scratched behind the dog's ears with his good hand. "You tried to tell them, didn't you, boy? You knew where I was all along." Duke's tail wagged harder, and Emma climbed onto the bed to hug the dog. "Daddy's friend is the bestest dog," she declared with absolute certainty. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Carlos Rodriguez, Jason Webb, Marcus Freeman, and David Chen were indicted on a combined 37 counts including attempted murder, drug trafficking, evidence tampering, and corruption. Carlos's expensive lawyers couldn't argue against the mountain of evidence Miguel had compiled or the physical evidence of Miguel's injuries. All four men accepted plea deals to avoid trial, receiving sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. The custody hearing was permanently dismissed. No one questioned that Emma belonged with her father and grandmother. 6 months later, on a crisp March morning, Judge Patricia Hallbrook sat in the same courtroom 3B where Emma Rodriguez had spoken her first words in 44 days. But this wasn't a custody hearing. This was a special commendation ceremony, something the judge had personally arranged. Miguel Rodriguez stood at the front of the courtroom in his dress uniform, his limp barely noticeable now after months of physical therapy. Beside him stood Detective Sarah Chen and Duke, the German Shepherd wearing a special ceremonial collar. Emma sat in the front row with Maria, swinging her legs and beaming with pride. "Officer Rodriguez," Judge Hallbrook said, her formal tone softened by genuine emotion, "your courage, integrity, and dedication to justice exemplify the finest traditions of law enforcement. In the face of corruption and mortal danger, you chose to protect your community and your daughter by ensuring the truth would come to light. This court and this community owe you an enormous debt of gratitude." She presented Miguel with a Medal of Valor, the highest civilian honor the county could bestow. Then she turned to Duke, and to K-9 Officer Duke, whose loyalty and persistence solved this case when human investigators had given up. "We present this commendation for extraordinary service." Sarah Chen accepted the plaque on Duke's behalf, though the dog's attention was entirely focused on Emma, who was barely containing her excitement in her seat. After the ceremony, outside the courthouse in the sunshine, Miguel knelt down beside his daughter. Duke sat next to them and Maria stood behind, her hands on Emma's shoulders. "Thank you, Mija," Miguel said softly. "If you hadn't been brave enough to speak up, if you hadn't remembered our secret trip, I might not be here." Emma threw her arms around her father's neck. "Daddy's friend helped," she said generously, then turned to hug Duke. "He's our dog now, right?" Sarah Chen smiled. "Duke officially retired last month, and yes, he's all yours." The German Shepherd's tail wagged as Emma kissed the top of his head. After 44 days of trying to tell humans what he knew, after leading rescuers to his friend when everyone else had given up hope, Duke had finally completed his mission. Now he could rest, part of the family he'd worked so hard to save. As they walked to the parking lot, Miguel with his slight limp, Emma skipping between her father and grandmother, Duke padding along beside them, Maria looked back at the courthouse one final time. That building had nearly torn their family apart, but it had also been where a little girl found her voice again. "Daddy's friend," Emma had said, 2 words, just 2 simple words that had meant everything. Now, 6 months later, those words had transformed into a future none of them thought they'd have. A father restored, a family reunited, justice served, and a loyal dog finally home where he belonged. Emma looked up at her father, her voice bright with childish joy. "Can Duke sleep in my room tonight?" Miguel laughed, the sound rich and full of life. "Tonight and every night, Mija, tonight and every night." And in that moment, standing in the Missouri sunshine with his daughter's hand in his and a faithful dog by his side, Miguel Rodriguez understood that some bonds, between fathers and daughters, between partners in service, between those who fight for what's right, can never be broken, no matter how deep the darkness or how long the silence. Emma had spoken when it mattered most. Duke had never given up, and a family torn apart by corruption and violence had found its way back together. In Courtroom 3B, Judge Patricia Hallbrook watched them from her window, a rare smile crossing her stern features. She'd seen a lot in 23 years on the bench, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. Sometimes, she thought, justice isn't just about the law. Sometimes it's about a 3-year-old's memory, a dog's loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter. Sometimes 2 words really can change everything. The end.